Nature Dork universe. So I've been going for about a year, and here we are a year later with 20 greasy episodes to show for it, and 340 diehard brave subscribers. Today's episode we're going to make some birch trees. So the reason why I'm going to show you this is because I like to do stuff that you haven't seen before, and we've seen a lot of people doing trees, and there's a lot of great products like these Woodland Scenics tree armatures, and they're very cheap, and the trees are very convincing and nice, but first step to make your birch trees and beat the $16 a tree cost of the things that are commercially available, which is completely wretched, is to simply go out and select some twigs. Okay, so what you want is you want wood that has a bit of flexibility to it. You don't want something too brittle. Now this stuff is quite wet, which is also what you want. Get something damp so that when you go to take the bark off, it will be an easier process. Why do I want to take the bark off, Davies? Well, you want to take the bark off mostly because birch trees, their bark sort of, it has a sort of papery texture, and in 15 millimeter scale, I'm just going to paint that texture on later, but we'll show you as this goes on. So I'm cutting sections of the tree, and I'm using a 15 millimeter figure, which I had here, just to sort of get an idea of how big I want the tree to be and how thick I want the trunk to be. Birch trees tend to be fairly thin, and they're characterized by having a very long trunk, and they don't have a lot of branches, and they don't really branch out until it gets near the top. This particular twig is going to require some whittling to get the bark off. I'm being very careful not to press too hard because, again, we don't want those straight, sort of faceted looking cuts. So you got to be quite careful. The next step to the fun-loving program is to put our branches in place. I've used sea foam. I bought my sea foam at Green Stuff World, but if you have a hobby shop that sells this stuff, or sometimes even craft stores sell it, it's called sea foam, and it comes in bunches kind of like this. The only reason why I didn't use the sea foam stems for my tree is because they're a bit too almost like square in areas. Like they just don't have that sort of round, smooth look of a birch tree. So I put these in, and as I'm working on the tree, okay, I'm going to put this up so it'll probably go out of focus. Sorry about that. Always have blue tack. This stuff is great because when you're working on things like this, you just jam it in here, and then you're not resting the branches on, laying it flat and getting these things all messed up. I'm going to chop the top off, and I'm going to put a hole right down the top. This is also another reason why you want to get wood that is somewhat soft, because if you try to do this with wood that isn't springy and brittle, it's just going to break when you try to drill it out. And you will say bad words and punch things, and you won't succeed. Which is not what we're going for here. For here, we are on the success program, not the wretched failure program. If you want the wretched failure program, you're going to have to go to some other wanky website than this wanky website. Because this one is full success story, freaking hobby geek times. So you see, I'm just drilling this out carefully. And then I'm going to select a piece of sea foam that will make a good top of the tree. We want one that's relatively bushy, not one of these thin pieces. That's too thin. Who wants that at the top of their tree? Here's some big bushy ass pieces. My cat Tony's over there having a little, he has some stuff to say. He's basically telling me that I'm a geek. He's not wrong. The next step will be to give the tree a bit of a coating, just to protect it, to strengthen it up where you've glued in the branches, especially at the joints. Just add a bit more. I'm going to spray the whole tree with a bit of rubbing alcohol and just sort of dabble in some thin down, either soft gel or Mod Podge. I'm going to use soft gel, but you could use either. Soft gel is acrylic. So the acrylic in this golden soft gel is a bit more plasticky, although it's still elastic. I think it's a bit tougher. Mod Podge is polyvinyl acetate. So vinyl acetate, it's kind of, well, it's like white glue or wood glue essentially. So it's pretty strong, it's pretty elastic. Both will work well, but I'm going to choose this because I do feel it's a little bit stronger. It's more expensive, so that's why I have both. I'll use Mod Podge when I'm doing like
it's
a large
fucking Mod Podge,
batch
you
of
wanker.
something, and then I use my golden soft gel. Generally when I'm working on something like modeling or painting, or doing like smaller terrain bits where I want, you know, things like little rocks and sand and whatever to stick down, or I use it for my static grass, as opposed to this. I feel like it has a bit more bite. So that's what we'll do. So what I do is water it down. I'm going to get like a paint palette, and I'm going to get a fairly, we'll get some of the texture with the acrylic gel too. It's easier to introduce brush strokes, or you can, you know, use a sponge or whatever. You can do that to a degree with Mod Podge too, but the acrylic gel especially, you know, this is soft, but you can get medium and heavy. Those medium and heavy gels really allow for the adding textures. So I'm gonna just thin it down with water, as you see here, and I'm going to also put in some rubbing alcohol. That allows it to thin down a bit quicker, and it also allows it to dry a bit quicker, which are both good things. Going to start off with the tree that my beloved cat Tony, he likes to chew grass and eat plants, and so he came up to this and just started tearing all the sea foam out of it. If he wasn't such a beloved member of our family, he might be a nice pair of mittens right now. But most of the time, Tony is genuinely an excellent chap, so we'll let him off the hook for this one. So see, I'm just putting my brush in all of these little joint areas to ensure maximum toughness where it's at its weakest points. So I put some of the acrylic gel in there, and I'm just going to thin it down with a bit more rubbing alcohol. Of course, the rubbing alcohol will probably dry it out too, and I'm just going to flick off some of the excess just so that we don't have a bunch of glue in the corners. A little piece fell off. You can probably stick it right back on. Then I'm going to go with horizontal brush strokes across the trunk. Most of the sort of birch tree texture, though, we're just going to get in by painting, and it'll look fine in the scale. And why do I say this with such confidence? Because I've done it, but I've done it before. So yeah, we'll save the big reveal till later on.
once again I don my mask and my latex painting suit. Okay, I don't have one of those. We are now going to paint the trees. We are going to start with Vallejo. Surface primer, white, because the fucking trees are white. They're white. Give it a good shake. My cat Tony is looking at me as though I was somewhat fucked. Of course, he's partially correct. With lots of the paint in the paint cup and engage the air compressor. And begin.
Very good count.
Now that we have the tree primed white, we are going to add some color to the ends of the branches, which are typically a little bit brownish. They can be reddish brown or grayish brown. I don't care which brown you choose, just choose a brown. In this case, I'm just going to use a drop of red-brown surface primer and a drop of black surface primer. Put a bit of brown in, and a little bit of black. And we just mix it in the cup. That's all we need. We don't have to be too particular. Just be careful. Only hit the ends. Don't hit your trunk, or you will smell. If you do hit the trunk, just paint it out with some white on a paintbrush. But try not to be a dick. And try not to paint the trunk. That's good enough. Something like this would be good enough. Don't overdo it.
Now let's move on to our groundwork. So I'll show you how I do it. I start off with this product called Celluclay, which is just a ready-made paper mache. Yeah, I bought this in the 90s. Like one bag of it, and I'm still using it now. I'm not even kidding. So I have no idea how much it costs now, but it's probably worth it if it lasts you like 3 decades. And I swear I use it all the time. Like this is how I base all my infantry and all my trees, and anything that has a base has this Celluclay in it. So even if it is a bit pricey, like I said, I don't know how much it is now. When I bought it, I think it was about $10 for a bag. In the 90s, maybe it's like twice that much now, but still using it 3 decades later. So this is just some model railroad ballast that I've chucked in. And then also I have a jar of beach sand that I've collected from the beach because it's nice and fine beach sand. And you know, I don't bother to treat it with anything. It's just straight up. I think it should be okay. There's no insects or anything coming out of it yet. It's freaking sun blasted all day, so anyway. And then I will put paint directly into it. So I always mix for Groundwork brown and gray. And you don't have to be too particular about your quantities. I just put in a few drops of each. And then I'm going to put in some of my golden gel. You could also use Mod Podge or PVA glue. I'm going to use this though because it's a little bit more plasticky. I use my PVA stuff for like watering it down and sealing in things at the end of the day, but for serious gluing I use my gel. I think I've already mentioned that, but you know, I'll be like a broken record. When you introduce water into it, I use an eyedropper so that you can control the amount because you don't want it too watery. If you put it in with a tap, you might get a nasty surprise. So in order to avoid that, I just chuck it in with a eyedropper. You can get an idea about how much groundwork you get for the amount of, you know, I just put in a pinch of that celluclay. And I'm just going to mix it up, and you want it probably about this texture. When I look at this and look at my basing, I'm thinking I'm going to need to make a bit more. So I'm going to do that. Just going to get another pinch of the celluclay, maybe twice that much would be good. Another pinch. Okay, here's, hopefully I can show this. This is a coffee can. I'm going to zoom out. This is how much I have left after. Hopefully it won't. This is how much I have left after, well, I guess 30 years. The 90s, that's 30 years. Oh my God. So, yeah. And that was just, it's very compressed in the bag, so when it comes out, it all poofs up. And I use that, like I said, for every basing project I've done in 30 years. Has that much celluclay in it, so can't go wrong with that unless you don't like things that are cool. I'm going to add a bit more paint to it just because I increased the amount of celluclay. And it's looking very gray, so I put a bit more brown in. I think there's enough beach sand and ballast to carry it out. I'm also going to do like forest basing, so I'll show you how I do that. So there's going to be a lot of stuff covering the groundwork too, so yeah, you might not need to go as heavy with your added rocks and sand. You can also use like the stucco textured, you know, like Vallejo or golden acrylics to add more of a sandy texture to it, but it's a fairly good groundwork. And I use a paint tool like this to apply it, and I'll show you the other tool that I use. So I'll use a tool like this to get the paper mache onto the base, and then if I need to push it into a particular area, I'll use a tool like this. So on one side, I think this is some kind of a cuticle pusher or something. To be honest, I don't know what kind of fucking tool this is. Now, the next step, I've changed my backdrop so we see things a little easier. The next step is to paint in the birch bark. And we're just basically going to add a very dark grayish brown and just make sort of crescent shape and angular shape sort of patterns randomly, and then come with a really fine brush like one of these fellows, and then just make the odd straight lines. And that in conjunction, like here you can, well, you might not be able to see it on here, but as mentioned before, when I brushed the acrylic gel on horizontally with a fairly, not a nice brush, a fairly thick brush, you get those brush strokes and they sort of emulate the birch bark texture. And so paints used, you don't have to be too particular about this. I'm just going to move my little backdrop here so we don't have that. So for the very bottom of the tree, I just used black gray, like this area. When I looked at photos, there's an area where it's kind of more like a more, like other kind of tree bark, like that. I gotta say that in a way that isn't stupid. When I looked at photos, this area around the bottom looks like standard tree bark. It doesn't look like birch bark, and it's usually quite dark, especially against the white tree bark, so everything looks a lot darker. So I go dark with my paints. So the first color I laid down is just black gray Vallejo. And then for all the lines and little spots that I put on, I made a mix of just dark gray and burnt umber Vallejo model color. You don't want it quite as dark because then it, against the white bark and taken down to 1/100 scale, it's just going to be probably too black. I wanted it, it almost looks black as it is, but it does have a bit of a brownish gray tinge to it, which is what I want. I think it looks very convincing, yeah, to say the least. And another thing I do with my paints is I give it a little shot of golden retarder. You can buy Vallejo stuff, but this big bottle of golden is way cheaper. So let's fuck this beer off and get down to business. So I've painted the base. Again, just however you do bases, and if you're like, I don't know how to do bases, Davies, maybe just let me know in the comments. I know I made a wanky voice, but I'm not really making fun. If you are a new person, and it would be great if there were new people in the hobby, and you want to know how to do this kind of stuff, yeah, just let me know in the comments, because I'm happy to show you. I'm just assuming that a lot of you guys are old fellas like me and you do this shit the way you do it. But if not, I can show you, or, I'm sure there's tons of videos on basing, but if you, and that goes with any of my videos, if you see anything about my work that you like in particular, that's specific to what I'm doing, then I'm always happy to show. So just let me know in the comments if you're ever watching these and I'm skipping out something that you wish I didn't. Just be like, hey, Dick, show me how to do that, and I'll fucking do it. So anyway, I've glued the leaves on, and the way I do it is I use cheapo super glue. I don't use my good hobby super glue, I just use the cheap shit. Because you use a lot of it, but I find you get it on and I don't have to go back later and spray it with a bunch of shit to seal it in, because the super glue is super glue, it holds the stuff on. See, I've tapped it and very little leafy shit has come off. And so that's good. However, if you find that there's a lot of glossy super glue still showing, which there shouldn't be if you get adequate amount of the leaves on, You could always spray it with your like Mod Podge or, you know, scenic cement or whatever you use for that. And the leaves I use are from Green Stuff World. If you're not familiar with Green Stuff World, I'd fucking get familiar with it because it's awesome. Well, it's awesome, but you might cry a little because you're going to spend a lot of money because this shit is so cool. So what I've done is I've taken light green leaves and medium green leaves, because here I'll float some pictures of actual birch tree leaves. They're fairly smallish and they are light. So, and then if you're doing fall, well, obviously fall colors. I'm not sure if they have these leaves in fall colors yet, but if they do, that'll be cool. Or of course, if you're doing a winter birch, you just leave it like this. I think if I was to do a winter birch, here, we'll let that focus in. However, I would paint the ends of the branches even darker. Like I'd kick it in with a little bit of black. And then they will look good. Just don't overdo it. So yeah, we're going to use these leaves. We're going to use these leaves and glue them on with Gorilla Glue. And what I do is I pour about half and half into a larger container, because we want tonal variety, right? And then I just shake that shit up, and then, yeah, you'll get that sort of tonal variety. And having done this, you know, and if I was a freaking rich, I would have actually bought one of the dark green as well, and just put, you know, not half and half and half, or, you know, done it in thirds or whatever. But I think if you had a pinch of the dark and just mix that in, you'd get an even nicer tonal variety. So without further ado, why don't I just shut up? Yay! So the final step will be to add some forest floor sort of scatter to the bases. And I might add some like grass tufts and green shit and stuff, but I'll put the forest floor stuff down first. I even have little plastic notch ferns and things. I don't think I'll add it to this. I just want to get it done and move on to the next. But if you wanted to add things like that, I encourage it. So this is my forest floor scatter that I've made. And what I did, I'll just get a scoop here so I can maybe show you a bit better. I have ground up actual leaves. I got a bunch of dry fall leaves and I ground them up in the coffee grinder, and I also threw in some wood of various types, some twigs and some dowel, and I ground it all up in the coffee grinder. And so you get this stuff that looks very good when you glue it down. I'm going to use some of the acrylic soft gel for this. Yeah, when you glue that down, it takes on a really nice texture. I've also added, you probably won't see it, but I took a piece of bamboo coffee filter that had been used to make coffee, so it turns a particular color and texture when it dries out. And I cut them into little tiny diamond shapes. And it sort of looks like dead leaves. They're very stylized, and up close you kind of see that they're diamonds, but from a distance, like a gaming distance, it actually looks like dead leaves. That same Green Stuff World has these awesome paper punches where you can punch out leaves, but they just don't have anything that I think looks particularly good for 15mm scale. So what I've tried to do with these little diamond shape, you know, I just cut like diagonal lines and diagonal lines until I get these tiny little diamond shaped pieces of you know, brownish paper. It does give a bit of it implies those loose single dead leaves. They don't look quite as nice as the paper punches that punch those leaf shapes out. But again, it looks pretty good. From a distance, does the job. Okay, so once again we have our golden gel acrylic shit out. And I'm going to take one of these paint palettes and a fairly crappy brush. I'm just going to take a bit of this stuff and jam it in a fairly clean tray with a bunch of water and a bunch of alcohol. The alcohol will help me mix it up with the water, but it also helps it dry a bit faster. And I'm just going to make a fairly thin coat of this, and this is what I'm going to use to glue down my forest floor. Some of the paint underneath is coming off, unfortunately, but because we're putting forest floor down, I imagine these brownish paint chips and greens might even just add to the overall effect. So I've made it about the consistency of milk, and I'm going to paint it on the base. I'm going to leave the rocks exposed, sort of, just so that we don't negate putting them on in the first place. I'm going to put a fairly thin coat of this all the way around. Actually, it's not that thin. I'm putting on a fairly thick coat. Don't listen to that.
What a dick.
Fairly thick. It's somewhat haphazard. That's okay. Try to keep it off the bottom. If any makes it to the bottom, just wipe it away so it doesn't stick to the table. Yeah, so I've got this reasonably well covered. I'm going to move this out of the way, and I'm just going to take this scoop and I'm just going to start to sprinkle on my forest floor scatter, and I'm not going to be too worried about how it falls on the paper here. I'll just pour it off later. I'm going to knock off some of the excess and take some of the stuff that's around the edges and push it up, just so that it doesn't get knocked off further down the road. And I will go back later with some rubbing alcohol and a syringe and drop some of this stuff in. The rubbing alcohol will just help push it through the glue. And there's areas where you can start seeing the glue soaking through altogether. I just add a bit more. And when I have those, when those little leafy pattern things that I cut out are there, I push them down to ensure that they do in fact get stuck. And it will add to the overall effect. I'll set him aside to dry, so that's how that's going to be looking. What I did to seal in the base is I took rubbing alcohol. This says 70, but it's actually 90. I just use this because of the spray. I spray it with rubbing alcohol. Psst, psst, psst. Give it a mist of rubbing alcohol, and then I take my mixture of acrylic gel and water, or Mod Podge.
It's fucking Mod Podge, you wanker.
Pick it up.
What a dick.
This eyedropper, or a pipette if you prefer, and then I just drop it doot, 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 on the top. Doot, doot. And there we have it. The bases are done, and thus the project is complete. I'll show some stills at the end of this, so you can see them set up in different ways, so you can actually see the tree. But here's my log made out of the plastic sprue. It's just a fallen piece of log. And I feel that the forest floor stuff that I put on looks pretty good. I just added some moss and some tufts of like flowers and things like that to look like forest floor cover that pops up. And I think you get a fairly reasonable looking birch tree without, it looks good for what, the kinds of skills you need to make this and the effort that's put in. You can pop out a pretty legit looking tree pretty quickly, and I think it looks superior to what you'd be paying 17 or 18 bucks for. But I'll let you be the judge of that. I hope you've enjoyed this exciting and I don't know if we can call it exciting, but whatever you want to call it, hopefully it helps you out. And now you've got birch trees, which will be present in just about any European or North American battle that you might be putting on in your historical.
Greasy music alert in T-minus 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Liking and subscribing to Miniature Dork Universe makes you 97.382% more attractive to women.
No, it doesn't. For fuck's sake.